Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to, or welcome back to Getting Over versus Being Put Over. I am your host. And let's get right into it. Ladies and gentlemen, let's talk a little bit about the Texas territory, if you will, and how it all works out. We're going to be talking to, Gary Hart and Sean Oliver, where we're going to go in, well, they're going to go in depth, if you will, on how the Texas territory worked, how the office worked, promoters, so on and so forth. It should be an interesting talk, I think. I think one of the things that that when you find back in the territory days is I think it's fair to at least assume that a lot of the promoters had their own stable of wrestlers and they didn't have to go anywhere else, you know what I'm saying, unless they wanted someone in particular in another territory. And so they just set up their own events because they have all the wrestlers. In actuality, that's not the case. Promoters actually have to work through an office, depending on what the city that they were in, to actually bring in the talent, if you will, or use their talent. And then they would orchestrate what the show would be. The office gets a cut, the promoter gets his cut, and so on and so forth. And it's all a big thing. And so, and you're talking about at that time, it was almost strictly a cash business, if you will. Don't get me wrong, checks were cut in certain places, but in a lot of places, these guys paid all them dues in cash. You know what I mean? Right out the, easy. Either they stuffed it in envelopes or they paid them outside out of their cars and shit, whatever the case may be, because it was primarily a cash business. So we're going to find out a little bit about how the Texas territory worked. Some territories worked this way, some didn't. It depended on the promoter and the office itself. And yet again, if the promoter actually had his own stable, or if he had to actually get talent from somewhere else, on top of how did they work it out to bring talent in, and so on and so forth. And we're going to find out, if I remember, if the interview is correct, this is the right interview, I should say, who was the real power in Texas back in the day, which I think is very... which for any of you guys who are big time wrestling fans, you already know that was the Von Erichs. But, it'll be fun to kind of go through all this. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are here with, this is a Sean Oliver interview, but it's Gary Hart in depth on how the Texas wrestling territory system worked. This was published on September 14th of 2019. The link to the videos that I use will be down in the description. All right, ladies and gentlemen, give me a second to go ahead and square up, and I'll see you guys in just a second.
You bring up an interesting point when you're talking about today, the absence of that learning process today, being on the road. You know what they do, they have these developmental territories that crop up now. Mm-hmm. But you're right, what is lost is that journeyman experience. Yes. Working for the fans in Dallas, and then working for the fans maybe in San Francisco for a while, and then going up to Portland and working for the fans. Mm-hmm. You learn the country, you learn the different personalities of different areas.
And
of the
you
country.
also learn different styles.
Yeah, exactly. People forgot how to work, essentially. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're here with Gary Hart and Sean Oliver in depth on how the Texas wrestling territory system worked. This was published on September 14th of 2019. Yet again, the link will be down in the description. Yet again, as they're already kind of delving into the fact that wrestlers now, or sports entertainers or performers or whatever you want to call them, they are poorer now than they've ever been. Not necessarily financially, though that's debatable depending on who you're talking to, but in that of experience. They didn't have the opportunity to work in other places, see other arenas, deal with other people that were in a city that haven't, that either weren't going to leave or they've already made their rounds and they've decided to plant roots where they're at. That's something that's lost. And I think if we had more of that, if we had the territory system in a much more constructive sort of way, I think a lot of the nonsense in the fact of people trying to compete for spots. I think you may have less people botching. I think a lot of the silliness that you kind of see now with spots and stuff like that, it wouldn't fly in certain places. So those individuals would be only relegated to one place. Like you kind of see that right now in AEW to some extent. But I think quickly stuff like that will kind of get squashed out. But there's always going to be a place for that somewhere. Like, you know, if you look at Orange Cassidy, he's someone that I find actually rather entertaining. Some people say back in the territory days he wouldn't fly. There's always at least one or two places that'll deal with that shit. It'll be harder to get over in other territories, but there's always one or two spots that will deal with some of that nonsense. But then again, there's other stuff out there that it wouldn't. Those guys are going to have to shape up or they're not going to get booked. You know, I'm not to name any particular names in general, but it's a thing. So but yet at the same time, it builds a much more versatile performer, wrestler, better conditioned not only physically, but how to work and wiser to the business, which is something that Jim Cornette, for example, advocates quite a bit. And you're only going to know that if you travel and if you work in different places under different rules. You know what I mean? And not everybody basically treating this shit like it's the clique and everybody having the run of the mill or buddying up with everybody else and no one's really accounted for anything. It's slowly but surely hurting the business for who's going to come later. And that's kind of the thing that I think people take for granted, is a lot of what the earlier wrestlers did before the Attitude Era, you know, so you're talking about back in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and even the 90s, they laid down the groundwork for what's going to come later. You know what I mean? And for those who are going to follow them. You look at what you're looking at now, who knows where the wrestling business or sports entertainment or whatever you want to call this is going to be in another, I don't know, 15, 20 years with the way we're going. You know what I mean? And that's something that needs to be taken. It should have already been taken into heavy consideration. And sadly, it's because of that you have a bunch of people kind of sitting around, not to be overly gruesome about the situation, but you got a bunch of people sitting around waiting for Vince McMahon to die. Because then they think eventually some type of normality will come to the business, because it'll be they don't think Hunter or Stephanie will try to squash everybody else, and maybe some form of normality will come back. I don't think it's going to happen as soon as people think, even if it ever does. And if it does, it'll take a decade. Maybe two. Who could say? But that's either which way. Like I said, performers, wrestlers, sports entertainers are worse now than their predecessors were, which is a shame. You know what I mean? Which is a shame. But it is what it is. It's the price that needs to be paid, right? For some type of advancement in the business, if one wants to call it that. I don't know if you say predecessors, it'd be your ancestors, right? I always kind of get that mixed up.
Like Texas was a hardcore, I guess you would call it, stiff. If you came to Texas and you were going to wrestle in Texas, you were going to make a name for yourself. You had to be able to take an ass whipping every night. Yeah. Loads of guys came through, and the biggest complaint I had, and they would say to me, God, do these guys have to kick so hard and hit so hard? I don't know if I can take it. And I would be very clear. I'd say, hey man, this is Texas wrestling. We beat the shit out of each other. And if you can't take it, it's best you leave now, because it's not going to get any better. There were other territories where guys would work extremely loose. If they wanted to pull your hair, they'd just lay their hand up there. Right. In Texas, you would grab a handful and pull the guy down. Right. If you would kick a guy in Texas, you would lay it in. And if you could leave bootlaces, that was even better. No wrestler in Texas went to the ring without black and blue marks on his chest, his back. Uh-huh. It was very, very stiff. We called it snug. Other people called it stiff. Like I said, there were some areas where high spots or wood spots or whatever they call them. That was what the match was all about. But you try that in Texas, they boo you out of the ring. Right. We had guys.
And see, when you look at the Von Erichs, for example, right, and you see the type of matches they were in, and a lot of the way they wrestled or whatnot. A lot of people said they were kind of reckless in the ring. I don't think it was, not all of it anyway. I wouldn't say all of it was reckless, but they certainly were going hard in the paint because that's how they were brought up. What I find rather fascinating now that I've been kind of like spending some time looking into him and whatnot is Gino Hernandez. When you got a pretty boy motherfucker like that who is very, very particular about at least his face anyway, for the most part, and out there wrestling in Texas and whatnot, and some of those he's had some great matches, and certainly some rather brutal matches to say the very least. I would be anxious to hear some stories of him taking a particular shot behind the scenes, or taking a particular shot in the ring, I should say, and how he reacted when he got to the back. Because there's stories of him freaking out because he might have been in a match with one of the Von Erichs or someone along those lines, and he took like a hit to the face, and his eyes started to puff up. Not to say that it got blackened, but it started to puff up. He was freaking out and shit, throwing stuff around, saying, "Give me a mirror, give me a mirror. How the fuck is he gonna do this to my face?" Like stuff like that. Outside of the guys in Texas being very particular as it pertains to how they work, they were definitely characters, to say the very least. At least I'm slowly but surely learning that.
Johnny Valentine, Fritz Von Erich, Don Jardine the Spoiler, Wahoo McDaniel. I mean, he would beat you to death. And if you couldn't take it, you didn't work with Wahoo, but you lost a lot of money.
Right. Yeah. Speaking of Texas, how was that territory defined boundary-wise? Because, you had the Blanchard and San Antonio and stuff. So, specific to Fritz, what was the Dallas territory?
There's a big misconception on that. Paul Boesch had one town. Joe Blanchard had two towns. They had no talent. The booking office controlled the talent, so therefore we controlled the promoters. We had anywhere between 16 and 18 guys in our booking office in Dallas while I was the booker. I didn't want to keep more than that because if I had 20, 22, some guys would be off.
Right.
And I tried to keep it anywhere between 14 and 16 guys. Now, without the Dallas booking office, Joe Blanchard, where could he get his talent? Would he fly everyone in from Bill Watts? Would he fly everyone in from Vince?
Right.
The same thing with Paul Boesch. So that's a misconception that Dallas was just a little place here, then Paul and Joe were separate. They weren't. Without the talent from the Dallas booking office, they had no talent.
Mm-hmm.
If I would say to Joe one day, "Look, Joe, we're no longer interested in booking your town because it's not profitable for us," where would Joe go? Would he go to L.A. to Mike LaBelle and fly in 12 guys? Would he go to Bill Watts and fly in 12 of Bill's guys? And do you think that Bill would allow them to use his talent anywhere, any way they wanted to? That was my big problem. Two big problems in Texas.
So, the Dallas booking office, or I would say any booking office in any particular city that wasn't run by a promoter, they legit had control of everything. And if, as he just said, if he's like, "Hey, if we don't find that it's profitable working one of your cities, or one or two of your cities," because he said that Blanchard had two cities, he said Paul Boesch only had one. Paul Boesch would probably be fucked. I would assume Blanchard would be not in the best spot either, even though he has two cities. God damn, dude. So how the fuck is all these guys making all this money and they don't have at least... All right, let's hear with Jesus Christ. But then again, that just goes to show, ladies and gentlemen, on how everybody can make money. If you really think about it, if you really take this in and you really look at it from an objective standpoint, anybody and everybody could make money back in those days. And I think it's one of the reasons why Vince Jr. Was so quick to stamp all this shit out. He didn't feel that one man, that all this power should continue to be controlled moving forward, especially if you're going to go national. It's like, man, screw all that. We don't need middlemen or whatnot. I'll be the promoter and I'll be the owner and I'll have this stable and so on and so forth. But then you get into the ethics of it all, where how is everybody independent contractors, right? Because that's what supposedly these wrestlers are supposed to be, independent contractors. But yet they're all obligated to be at events and show up to a certain amount of events, so on and so forth, contractually. They're like, it's weird, but yet they're not provided with health care or anything, which is something that Sean Oliver talks about rather intently. Raven has spoken about it. He actually tried to sue over this. Jesse the Body Ventura spoke about this and tried to get something rallied up in either the late 80s or in the early 90s, but Hogan swerved him on it and fucked him over. It's an ongoing thing, and if you think about it, and if you see, I guess if you were able to put the numbers together, you could see why the McMahons are worth billions and billions of dollars, because of the fact that if you take they still would have been a billionaire even if he was providing healthcare for all performers. But in turn, like, at the end of the day, greed is greed. So, you know what I'm saying? Are you going to be content with $5 billion or $25 billion? If you think about it. You know what I'm saying? Obviously, I'm exaggerating the numbers here a bit, but just to give you guys an idea. So, just something to think about.
In the booking office, Paul Boesch liked to use world's champions. He didn't care if it was AWA, WWE, or NWA. And that was constant problems for me as the matchmaker, because I was a matchmaker for the National Wrestling Alliance. And every time he'd bring in Bruno or he'd bring in Nick Bockwinkel, I would catch hell from half the alliance. Gary, you got to stop doing this. But I was under a situation where I was booking Paul's towns, and he was paying us 40% of the gross. The same thing with Joe Blanchard. So I had to allow them the freedom to bring people in occasionally. But it's a misconception that Joe had a separate territory and Paul had a separate territory. No, Paul did not have any wrestlers that he employed. Joe Blanchard had no wrestlers he employed. All the wrestlers, if you wanted to come and wrestle in Texas, you called the Dallas booking office, you talked to Danny Pletches before me and Red Bastien before me. But as of 1976 until 1982, I was the guy. If you were going to come to Texas and work for Paul or Joe, you came through me.
That's interesting.
If I didn't want to use you, then Paul didn't have a chance to use you. But it's a big misconception, like it was three little different territories. It wasn't. There was Houston, San Antonio, Corpus, Dallas, Fort Worth, and then spot shows. But every piece of talent, the bulk of the card came from my office, and I ran the show. I did what I wanted to do.
That's almost. It's not predatory. I was thinking that initially, but that's not what the case is. Even though one could see it that way, it's definitely. That's definitely some entrenched gatekeeping, if you say the least. Because remember what he said earlier on. He didn't want to have any more than between 16, maybe 18 guys. He felt that 20 or 22 people or 22 wrestlers would be too many. So 16 to 18 was pretty good. So this way, he didn't have to give anybody any time off. More importantly, he was able to keep these guys working. I get that. And one could appreciate that if you were in that situation. At the same time, if you're a new talent trying to come in and you're trying to hit these cities, you're trying to hit these cities that Gary controls, because apparently he's actually at least one of the powers out there. If he's not willing to work with you, then I guess you have really no choice but to go through Fritz. To be honest, you don't really have a choice. So I'm wondering on what was Gary's qualifications, or what was he looking for to give somebody, an outsider, if you will, a shot into maybe not being a permanent fixture in his stable, but to at least periodically work. I'm curious on what he would require for that. Obviously, the toughness aspect of it. This is Texas. They play it real stiff out there. You can't take that. Get the fuck out. But I'm wondering if there anything else he might have been looking for in particular in a talent to allow them to work out there, even if it's just temporarily.
Because you got to remember, I had to keep my talent happy or they would leave. So I couldn't allow Joe Blanchard nor Paul Boesch to just use my talent any way I could.
Sure,
You
of course.
just can't do that. And that is a big misconception. Another thing people don't understand, not only do we have Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, Corpus Christi, and Houston, we had Amarillo, we had Lubbock, we had Abilene, we had San Angelo, we had El Paso, we had Lawton, Oklahoma. We had about 32 towns. But, you know, revisionist history
Yeah.
goes around. And most of the things that you hear about world class is not necessarily true. There was one power in Texas that was Fritz von Erich and who his booker was. Paul could not live without him. Joe could not live without him. A fact. Joe broke away in '79. He died a horrible death. Paul Boesch, one of the greatest promoters ever in wrestling, broke away in '79. He went a couple of years with Bill Watts, couldn't get along with Bill Watts. He went with Joe Blanchard, couldn't get along with Joe Blanchard. He went with Vince McMahon, he couldn't get along with Vince McMahon. So by 1982, in 2 years after running a successful promotion for over 30 years, without the talent and the direction of the Dallas booking office, not only did Joe Blanchard go out of business, Paul Boesch went out of business. So that is a bit of history that is factual, but not really mentioned. Joe Blanchard was the first guy that had USA TV, long before Vince. And he blew it.
Yeah.
He lost the TV.
Yeah.
So, I mean, a lot of this thing about Texas
Wait,
and
so
Paul...
okay, so there was already someone that had television before Vince, which kind of makes sense now why Vince was looking to get into Texas around when he could, you know, around that time, or why he was making that push into Texas, I should say. But how did he mess the situation up? Like, I mean, I would assume TV has certain qualifications. If you look back at Black Saturday, so that was what, 84, I guess, in Georgia. Ted Turner had a certain level of qualifications, or he had certain expectations that he wanted from the WWF. As long as they met that, they'd be all gravy. Now, obviously, Vince didn't like being told what to do and thought he could do whatever he wanted, and obviously that's what ended up dissolving that situation, which led to the birth of WCW, theoretically. Which, if you think about it, to some degree, it makes sense why Vince was so hell-bent on destroying WCW, because it's because of him that WCW even came about, if you think about it. But anyway, if they had if Texas had an opportunity at television, then why the fuck did they screw it up? Or how did they screw it up, I should say? More importantly, and as it pertains to the NWA, if any of you guys know, they were very much against the syndication or going national. They didn't want that because obviously that was just going to add more rivalry amongst them as a group. Even though most people say that they should have went all in together in national and going national, and they could have beat Vince, because then Vince can't predatorize any particular partner when they all got television and it's all under the NWA and whatnot, but just, you know, this branch or whatever the case may be. I don't know. I'm gonna have to look into that further, but that seems like an interesting story that needs to be told. And the fact that they would go ahead and not write out, because he didn't say that anybody lies about it, but they wouldn't talk about how Gary in the Dallas office was basically the true power in Texas outside of Fritz von Erich, is not necessarily surprising either, because, you know, you think if you've been in the area for a long time, or you look at who was in control for a long time, or at least the semblance of control, you want to keep everything consistent from a story standpoint, I guess. It's probably a level of pettiness too, at the end of the day. Behind every great story, or theoretically every great story, is a lie, you know what I mean, and it's behind that, or it's buried beneath it, is the truth.
And it was separate but equal. That's not
Yeah,
true.
I mean that's just what you hear. You know, every city gets a stamp. You know, Dallas, the Dallas office, the same thing in Houston.
Yeah, but they
separate territories.
Yeah,
but this is very
Dallas
interesting.
was the booking office.
Right. Sure. Yeah, I understand.
And you could not work in San Antonio or Houston unless you worked for the booking office out of Dallas.
Right.
Now, say you're Nick Bockwinkel. Paul could bring you in. We allowed that. Say if you're Bruno Sammartino, Dusty Rhodes, Ivan Koloff, we would allow that. One or two to keep him happy. Mm-hmm. But you got to remember, every time these two guys would bring someone in, it would mean knock one of my boys out of a night's work. Right. People don't remember that. They just remember, well, yeah, Paul was this, and Paul was a great promoter. Mm-hmm. Joe Blanchard was shits. He had no idea, no concept of anything. His greatest fame was he was a commentator for Jim Barnett when he was Jim's TV announcer. And Joe would have never had that position in Florida, in Texas, San Antonio. Fritz von Erich put him in there because Fritz and Joe were buddies.
Oh.
I was in the meeting the day that Fritz von Erich told Dorothy Brown and Frank Livingood, meet your new partner, Joe Blanchard, and they balked. We don't need a new partner. Well, he's your partner. That's how Joe got in. Paul got in because he was Morris Siegel's front office man. And Morris Siegel had a series of heart attacks, and he died, and Paul took over. And when that happened, Fritz and Ed McLemore took the booking office from Houston because the guys that were in the book was working for Paul and Morris. When Morris died, they said, we got to get out of here. You know, we can't trust anyone else. So that's when Fritz and Ed McLemore made the move and took the booking office to Dallas. And that's another reason that Paul Boesch and Fritz always had problems, because Paul felt that his whole life he had worked for Morris. Morris had the booking office. Morris dies. Fritz and Ed McLemore take the booking office. Paul ended up with one town. Now, if you have a booking office, you could carton to the amount of money drawn per week. You get, like Houston, we got 40%. San Antonio, we got 40%. West Texas with the Funks, we would only get 30, because when you get smaller arenas and smaller venues, you got to allow them to get a little more money.
Sure.
But Dallas, Texas, Fritz von Erich was the power in Texas. These other guys were his associates, and without him, they could not live.
Now,
Okay, so with that being said, why is Paul mad at Fritz when the talent themselves that came to the conclusion that, hey, if we don't get out of here now that this gentleman has passed away, if we don't get out of here now and go over there with Fritz, we're gonna be screwed. We're better off taking this shot now with the guy that we know, rather than going through this cat right here and gambling it out. That kind of makes sense, to be honest with you. So I don't know why he would hold any grievance about that. Now, well, yeah, I don't know why he's holding any grievance on it. I understand that Paul had, worked for that gentleman for a very long time, and now he's getting his opportunity to move up, and now he doesn't have any talent. But yet again, I mean, you can always cultivate more. You can even agree to pay people more money. At the end of the day, it's still a business, and business can still be done. But, just to outright hold a grudge over something like that seems a bit ridiculous under reasonable circumstances. But I mean, at the end of the day, business was still done, so they were still willing to push stuff to the side to make stuff happen.
System specific to Dallas. You guys are doing a loop of cities over a period of time, a week, 2 weeks, whatever, hitting the same cities. What did you travel with? Did you travel with the ring? Did you travel with, or were they at the venues, the individual venues?
Each town. Paul Boesch, Sam Houston Coliseum, he had his own ring.
Okay.
Joe Blanchard, the Hemisphere, or the Joe at Harry, had its own ring. Say a town like Carpets, it had its own ring.
Okay.
Every city that we ran in the biggest available building, and it was a ring stored there.
Okay.
How did we travel? We were very lucky. There's a thing called Southwest Airlines, and we could fly at very reasonable prices. Like, you could fly to Houston round trip, $36. You could go to probably Amarillo for $45. So we were traveling by plane long before most wrestlers because of Southwest Airline and Braniff. They were local companies that provided very, very cheap fares, and you could fly into, say, like Houston and catch the last plane out at midnight, or you could fly to San Antonio, catch the last plane out 10:30, 11 o'clock. So it was a wonderful way to do things. I mean, you didn't have I always hear, oh, you go to Texas, you drive 10,000 miles. Well, I never did, and I was in Texas for 20 years. And if I was going to San Antonio, I would fly. If I was going to Carpus, I would fly. Amarillo, Lubbock, Midland, Odessa, El Paso, I flew at my own expense. At my own expense. But it was so reasonable.
Right.
I mean, to drive your car and tear up your car and
Sure.
worry about fans cutting your tires and breaking your windows, take a cab in, you take a cab out. So
Right.
every promoter had his own TV, like Paul Weiss. He had his own TV station, he had his own truck that would come to the arena and tape it. Joe Blanchard had a TV station that provided him with a truck. The only thing that I provided, and well, Fritz and I, was talent. I would come in, I would book your show for you with you helping. You know, if you wanted something special, I'd say sure, fine, no problem with me. Then the night of the show, I would show up that afternoon. I would go over your TV with you, see what direction you wanted to go, and then I would run their shows for them as their matchmaker.
So let's talk about TV for a minute. As a book,
Okay, so if you look at it that way, then the Dallas booking office was invaluable to promoters. I mean, I don't know if it was, maybe it was cheaper just to have a Dallas booking office and just the promoters just bring them in and have those guys essentially doing the lion's share of it. You know what I mean? Since these guys already have television or have their, film trucks or whatever the case may be, the ring is either owned by the promoter or every large venue already has a ring. I mean, all these guys have to do is just basically help. They're basically coordinating the show, and then they just put it on, and that's it. And then just wait for the money to come in. It doesn't seem so bad now that you think about it. It might have been cheaper doing it that way. But I can also see why Vince tried to get control of everything. In any case, all right, ladies and gentlemen, give me a chance to straighten up. I'll give you guys final thoughts, and I will let you guys go on your way and whatnot, and you can enjoy the rest of your Sunday. See you guys in just a second. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, short but sweet, but I still think there was a valuable lesson learned as it pertains to how Texas, at least the Texas territory worked, how money was doled out, how were the wrestlers paired up, and so on and so forth, how travel worked. It seems extremely reasonable. I would say, though, too, that they must have been very strict to their schedule if you're going to go ahead and catch your flights the way you need to catch them. So I'll definitely put that out there. They must have ran that I mean, outside of a couple of blunders, I'm sure they must have ran a pretty smooth system out there. It's a shame that the Dallas office doesn't get the respect historically that it deserves, given the fact that they were the true power. But yet again, at the end of the day, there's always going to be people who are going to try to squash true authority. It's just a thing. It's something that's historical. It is what it is. But I think we learned a lot. I think we learned a lot at all. A lot. Here's the thing. For all the work that they did, the Dallas booking office, right? And they only took 40% for smaller towns. They only took 30%. And yet you had to do all of that, essentially. Wow, bruh. You know what I'm saying? You can see why those promoters were fucking rich. You know what I mean? And they were rich. When you think about those people who had territories, maybe not every territory, but the majority of those territories were extremely lucrative. You know what I mean? Extremely lucrative. So you can kind of understand why they were as rich as they were. And I think this gives you a better understanding of how at least some of the money was doled out, and give you guys just some of the inner workings. Ladies and gentlemen, as usual, the link to the video will be down in the description, so you guys can check that out at your leisure without my annoying voice, and you can kind of take that in. Also, I recommend that you always check the comment section of those videos as well. There's a wealth of information down there. You got some real wrestling heads out there who are dropping some knowledge, and it's there to be picked up. So definitely take that in and whatnot. That's very important. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's pretty much it. This is Getting Over versus Being Put Over. I've been your host, and I'll see you guys next week. Take care of yourselves, guys. Thank you. Fuck you. Bye, bacon.